Good evening, everyone. I'm Tracy Glab, the Executive Director of the Flint Institute of Arts Museum and Art School, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's Sheppy Dog Fun Lecture. Tonight, we have Dr. Jeffrey Chips Smith presenting the many posthumous lives of Albrecht Dürer, and it cheers my heart to see so many Dürer fans in the audience. The Sheppy Dog Fun Lecture Series was established in 2012 by Dr. Alan Klein to address the topics of art, religion, and history. Thank you, Alan, for continuing to bring these wonderful lectures to the FIA, and he's in the audience tonight, so give him a big round of applause. The next Sheppy Dog Fun Lecture will be on Wednesday, December 10th, with Dr. Lawrence Nichols presenting Stunned by Art, the Stendhal Syndrome. Before I introduce our guest, I would like to thank the Charles Stewart Mott Foundation for their continued support, which is so deeply appreciated and vital to the FIA. I would like to thank the citizens of Genesee County for demonstrating their support of the FIA by means of the Genesee County Arts, Education, and Cultural Enrichment Millage, which provides free entry to the FIA 7 days a week for Genesee County citizens. And a big thank you to Huntington Bank for sponsoring Huntington Free Saturdays, which allows everyone else beyond our county to have free entry on Saturdays. Thank you. I would also like to note that assisted listening devices are available. You can request one at the front desk or use your own Bluetooth device by scanning the QR code and downloading the Listen Wi-Fi app. Be sure to connect the FIA ALS Wi-Fi network before opening the app. Now, please take a moment to silence your electronic devices. Dr. Jeffrey Chips Smith, Professor Emeritus and K. Fortson Chair in European Art at the University of Texas, Austin, specializes in Northern European art from 1400 to 1700, especially that of Germany and the Netherlands. Smith's publications focus on Nuremberg and its culture, Albrecht Dürer, German sculpture, goldsmith work, Jesuits, Northern Renaissance art, among other topics. His latest books are Albrecht Dürer and the Embodiment of Genius, Decorating Museums in the 19th Century, Kunstkammer, Early Modern Art and Curiosity Cabinets in the Holy Roman Empire, and he was here at the FIA before and actually gave a lecture about that. If you're curious, you can find it on our YouTube channel if you missed it. And then Albrecht Dürer's Afterlife is another of his publications. He was also articles editor of Renaissance Quarterly and inaugural co-editor of the Journal of the Historians of Netherlandish Art. Everyone, please join me in a warm Flint welcome to Dr. Jeffrey Chips Smith.
Greetings. I'm glad to be back here. I wish to thank Dr. Alan Klein, Tracy, and also Catherine Schauerbaum. How many of you know anything about Albrecht Dürer? Who was Albrecht Dürer? Okay, a few of you actually know, as opposed to being drugged here tonight by somebody who might know something. So I want to give a bit of an introduction to it. Can I get this light possibly turned down just a little bit? Albrecht Dürer was born in 1471 in the city of Nuremberg. He would die there in 1528. And I'm going to make a claim tonight, which is not mine, just mine, that he's probably the greatest German artist that ever existed. But I will try to prove that to you, but it's an interesting thing because I'm talking a little bit about about the artist and his life, but mostly tonight we're going to be talking about what happened after he died. When you have no control over your legacy, you have no control over the art that you've made, you have no control over how it was used. Remember, this is before copyright, although Dürer is one of the pioneers of trying to get copyright for some of his works. But he was an artist who was a painter, a printmaker, a draftsman, a designer, a publisher, a theoretician, the inventor of German mathematical vocabulary. He was a poet, a terrible poet, an imperial court artist, Emperor Maximilian. He was a city councilor in Nuremberg and friend of nobles, humanists, and artists alike. And another claim I will make that he's the first European artist with broad international fame based upon direct observation of his original works of art, mostly his prints. Yes, you have Michelangelo, Leonardo, Raphael, but most people didn't know anything about them other than their names. Dürer, by making literally thousands of prints that circulated, maybe several 100,000 prints circulated during his lifetime around Europe and beyond, people knew his work and copied it widely. On the screen right now, we have the city of Nuremberg. He was born in a fortunate place. Nuremberg was one of the biggest, most powerful cities in Europe, probably 30 to 40,000 inhabitants. It was a major trade center, but also it was probably the most important town at least in Northern Europe, for metalwork, for making mechanical, very precision medical instruments and things like that, scientific instruments, other more daily or quotidian sorts of instruments. And we're seeing it in a view from 1493 in a book called The Nuremberg Chronicle, which was a spectacular history of the world from the beginning of creation up until about 1493. They didn't get Columbus in there, but up until almost everything. But it has this two-page spread, which you see right here, of the city with its imperial castle up here, the churches of St. Sebaldus and St. Lawrence, walls all around the city. They said we had 365 towers, one for each day of the year. That was hyperbole, but it was a well-fortified place. But it was a place where he found the creativity all around him that he would need. His father was a goldsmith from Hungary who ended up in Nuremberg, and he wanted his son to be a goldsmith as well, because goldsmiths, that was a well-paid occupation, much higher status than a mere painter. Painters were sort of mechanical artists, considered that way back then. But young Albrecht, who we see here in a self-portrait, how many of you have portraits, maybe your kids painted when they were little kids? Okay, so we have them on our refrigerator at home in Austin. But his parents kept this. This is as far as scholars know, probably the oldest self-portrait by an artist. He was only 13 years old when he did this. And he wrote about 25 years later, he inscribed some of his early works, and he put, I made this picture of myself in front of a mirror in 1484 when I was still a child, Albrecht Dürer. He's doing this because he wants people to see that he was a prodigy even at that point in time. But he probably learned drawing from his father, but he said to his father, probably when he was about 15, "Dad, I don't want to be a goldsmith." Just like your children saying, "Dad, I don't want to be a doctor or a lawyer or whatever." And so his father said, "What do you want to do?" And he says, "I want to be a painter." So down the street, a neighbor down the street was an artist named Michael Vulgemut, who was actually the individual who produced this particular book. And he was trained as a painter, a drawer, and a woodcut block designer in Vulgemut's shop. And this would set him on his career. Now, he quickly became the best woodcut maker in Europe through learning from Vulgemut. And in 1498, he was the first artist to publish a book that he also illustrated. So he had this entrepreneurial streak. He probably was recognizing that the apocalypse would probably sell, because what year was coming up? 1500. And there was lots of predictions that the world would end in 1500. The millennium would finally arrive. So he said, let's get out and sell things while we can. But he produced this luxurious book. It's about yay tall. And I show you, it has text on one side. The texts are you could buy it in a German edition, or you could buy it in a Latin edition. So text on one page and images such as you see here. A spectacular image. He was not the first to illustrate the apocalypse. You have medieval manuscripts and other traditions, even block books beforehand, but nothing like this. And it was an absolute bestseller. He would have a second edition of it in 1511 as well. And looking at something, just one of the pages, one of the best known, the four horsemen of the apocalypse, who you see right here. And the way he's designing it, he's taking the text from the book of Revelation, St. John's text, and he's trying to bring it to life. And bring it to life in a highly imaginative fashion. For instance, the idea of these riders of the apocalypse, death, war, strife, and such, moving across the landscape. I always feel like when I'm looking at this image, I'm staring out a window, and this is passing in a sort of horrific fashion before my eyes. It's already, whoops, go back, sorry. These buttons are next to each other. Back, not forward. You're seeing the whole lecture. Thank you. But you see in this case, the head of the horse is already out. This person's falling out. The figure of death right here, and the hell mouth immediately behind are just coming into the picture. The angel is sort of pushing everything forward. But when you look at this more closely, in this detail of the figure of death, shown as a skeletal figure riding on a pale horse, this hell mouth with fangs biting into a king down below. But it's what the lines do. The lines communicate, whether it's descriptive lines, whether it's shading lines. They bring this thing alive in a spectacular fashion. And we go from the whiteness of the paper right here to dense shading in the background. So this is a revolution in terms of what you could do with a woodcut. No other artist could achieve quite this sort of effect. Well, he did the same thing with engraving. This is Adam and Eve from 1504. Again, it's about this big. I remember being shown a copy back in the early 1980s from a dealer. He said, well, if you have $500,000, it could be yours. It was cheaper back in Dürer's time. But we see Adam and Eve, a subject that's one of the most common in all of Western art. But Dürer brings him alive in a different way. We have Adam, this full body, very masculine Adam, based in part, second hand on a classical sculpture, the Apollo Belvedere. Eve, more curved, rounded form, also based upon a Venus type, sort of the modest Venus type, set before this dense forest with animals all around, including a nice little goat up and back. Goat up on the hillside right there. And so when you look at this, and you look carefully at it, look what the lines do. Look what he's able to suggest. The rounding of the form, highlights, shading lines, sort of the curvature of the lines that you find right here, suggesting the musculature and the shoulders right there. Now, we all know what happened to Adam and Eve. They got kicked out of paradise. Eve is taking the apple, although the Bible doesn't tell you what fruit it was, taking the apple from the tree of life. They're going to be gone, but what's going to remain afterwards? Dürer's having a little bit of fun here because we have, on the tree of knowledge next to it, which different trees, Dürer has put his little cartolino, or his little shield, saying Albrecht Dürer of Nuremberg made this in the year 1504, and he did make mistakes. He had to correct the backwards 5 and a little bit later version of this. But it seems to me that he's thinking, okay, Adam and Eve leave the Garden of Eden, but Albrecht Dürer's name still stays there. He liked puns of this particular sort. Just a couple more images about Dürer. In 1514, he did one of his master prints, so-called master prints of St. Jerome in his study. When I look at this, I always feel like it's the mood. He can create a mood. Most artists with prints beforehand had a hard time creating sort of the sense of atmosphere, those intangible qualities. But he had the sense, through his light and shading, to get the sense that maybe this is like a Sunday afternoon. St. Jerome is busy translating the Bible into Latin, the Vulgate edition of it. He's busy working. But when you start looking at this, he creates spectacular spaces. He creates spectacular contrast between the dark areas and the light areas. Things like light shining through these bullseye windows, casting shadows on the side over here. Different textures, whether it's sort of the ephemeral light, the chip in the stone right there, the brittle quality of the skull, the softness of the book, of the pillows, the leather of the books down here, the hardness of this table, which just has little nicks on it, which you can see better in this detail if I get out of your way. You can see it just giving you a sense that this is a hard table. This trestle table is casting a shadow down onto the ground itself. But it's all just lines, black ink on paper. What's the brightest part of this whole print? What stands out most? The halo. And it's just the whiteness of the paper. but he's using it so effectively, you see it as something glowing. And I think this effect is quite spectacular. You can see why people liked his prints, and they copied them, they forged them, they stole them in many instances. He also made paintings. This is one of the most famous paintings from the Renaissance. Even though it just hung in his house during his lifetime, he probably made it for himself, for his family, for his friends who came over. It also could serve as an example of what he could do with paint, if anybody was so interested. It's a self-portrait. What does it remind you of? Okay, I hear Jesus, I hear Christ. Why does it remind you of Christ images? The hair, well, he had nice long hair, unlike your speaker. But the hair around, but also the pose, the frontal pose. Most portraits at this point in time tend to be three-quarters, or sometimes in Italy, in profile views. Yes, you have some that are frontal, but that was less common. But he's looking straight into a mirror. He's staring at you. There are images of Christ, the Savior, in prints and in drawings from the late 15th century. He may have used some of these as a model. But it's very unusual to make a model of Christ as yourself. Sometimes people say, was he blasphemous? No, that wasn't the case. Just it was a good model. It's actually based upon very precise geometric patterning in the composition. But we see him, and he's staring directly out at us. Again, this is a masterpiece in terms of light and shadow, but also detail, the way the fingers are rubbing the fur of the trim of his robe in this instance. But he's doing things that very few other artists in Northern Europe could do at this point in time. Come on. For instance, the eyes. I set this in contrast with a photograph by a German photographer, Andrew August Sander, did an Eye of Man in 1925. And so here's a photograph of an actual human eye, but here's Dürer's eye. And in both cases, you see the reflection of a nearby window, right here. But also, it tells you there's a window somewhere off this way. At least he's giving you the illusion of that, just with a few touches of white paint. So it gives you, again, a sense of what he's capable of doing with a brush, even though he's probably best known as a graphic artist. He did numerous larger paintings. This is one he did for the 12 Brothers House, sort of an almshouse for poor craftsmen in Nuremberg for a wealthy copper merchant, Matthias Landauer. He designed the frame, did the picture, and it's one that I show just because the colors are spectacular. So many of his paintings have been damaged over the 500 years or so since they were made. But who's not in heaven in this picture? Look carefully. We see a Holy Trinity up there. We see Old Testament figures. We see New Testament figures. We actually see the patron, Matthias Landauer, who's over here being welcomed. It's this sort of wish fulfillment. He wants to get into heaven. So Dürer showing him up there. Who's on the ground? Back. Come on, back. Back, not forward. Forward now. This is a little sensitive. Okay, finally. On the ground we have Albrecht Dürer. And he's there looking at us. He wants you, the aged craftsman of his almshouse, and anybody who comes to visit, to know that he, Albrecht Dürer of Nuremberg, painted this in the year 1511. The little cartolina, the little signs, are getting bigger and bigger and bigger. I show these things because he branded himself. His AD monogram was on virtually everything. He's somebody who's very conscious about the reception of his art and how it was being received elsewhere and copied elsewhere. He would die in 1528. He probably contracted something like malaria in December 1520 when he was in the Netherlands. He had heard, he was up there for about a year, he'd heard that a beached whale was in one of the islands near Zeeland, and he wanted to go see it, and he caught something. And so his health was broken after that. The tomb which you see in the St. Johannes or St. John Cemetery west of town looks like this today. He was buried in the plot of his in-laws, the Fry family. And as we see it today, this is how it was renovated in about 1680 by Joachim von Sandrart, another famous German painter and biographer of artists from the 17th century. When he died, the day after, his body was brought back up. And his friends took a death mask in clay. They took casts of his hands as well. These things existed until about 1724, when they were destroyed in a fire at the palace, the residence palace in Munich. But we do have one relic of his, a snippet of his hair. This was sent to one of his former pupils, another major German artist of this period, Hans Baldengrün in Strasbourg. And we can trace the provenance of this bit of hair from Strasbourg all the way to 1871, which was a Dürer Jubilee year. Also, 1871 is important. It's the year Germany became a nation, but it was bought by the Academy for Fine Arts in Vienna, and it's still there today. It's in a glass case with silver all around. It's like a relic, like a saint's relic. So this thing, every once in a while there's a Dürer exhibition, sometimes this thing is pulled out, so here's original Dürer hair. Whether it's his hair or not, I leave it to you to decide. Whether all saints' bones are truly from the saints, I leave that to you to decide as well. But it shows his fame. His friends wanted to have something to hold on to, if you like. And lots of commentary was made by Luther, Erasmus, various other nobles and such, scholars, Philip Melanchthon, about the passing of Albrecht Dürer, in a way that you don't have for virtually any other artist in Northern Europe at this point in time. Dürer had already commissioned a medal of himself that he gave to his friends in 1519. But around 1528, the year of his death, he may have commissioned this, but also this medal kept being produced after his death as a commemorative token for his friends who wanted to have an image of Albrecht Dürer in his later, shorter hairstyle. But you find lots of writings about him, sort of moaning that this great artist has passed away. One of the fellow Nuremberg masters, a man named Hans Sachs, who's noted for being a cobbler, but also the Meistersinger, so to speak. He would write a couple decades later on, quote, "Look closely," he's talking about a print, which is a portrait of Dürer. "Look closely, and you'll recognize the portrait printed here from life. It's Albrecht Dürer, the renowned painter of Nuremberg, laurel-wreathed. With his skilled hand, he far surpassed all other masters of his time, and not alone in this one art, but others such like arts besides, that made him honored near and far by nobles, princes, and great lords, and by all trained in the arts and crafts, for they still love and praise his art and draw on it as their firm base," unquote. So he's died. But there's an interesting reaction, because even though he's deceased, his art, his person, sort of the myths about him would continue well into the 21st century. Now, one thing artists did, they make copies. It's a standard way in your art school here. I'm sure certain artists are taught to, let's copy this or copy that, so you understand what that artist is trying to do. Well, Jan Wierix, over on the far left here, decided to make a copy of Dürer's print. He was only 16 years old, and it's not nearly as good as Dürer's print, but pretty good for a 16-year-old. I can't draw a straight line. But Wierix went on to be one of the best later 16th century printmakers in Antwerp. So this is sort of a typical of the borrowings, using him as a model. But sometimes well-established printmakers, like Hendrik Goltzius in Haarlem, probably the greatest late 16th century Dutch printmaker. A little bit later on, you have Rembrandt. The two of them are probably the best Dutch printmakers from the late 16th, 17th century. He did several prints in the style of Dürer. He would look back at this Dürer image of the woodcut of the circumcision. He looked at certain figures, like the figure here, and he said, oh, let's borrow some of these. He borrowed certain elements of the composition. According to a story that was published in about 1604, this print was first issued without Goltzius' name on it, without the little text you find down at the bottom down here. And people thought, oh, a new Albrecht Dürer has just been found. And it was sort of a joke that Goltzius was playing, because he said, okay, Dürer's great, and I'm just as good. Sort of this sense of rivalry, you sort of mimic the great artists of the past. And the scene, once you look at it more carefully, besides being, in fact, it's an engraving rather than the woodcut, here is Goltzius staring out at us. He did a little cartolina, or one of these little tablets with his name on it, and it's the Church of St. Bavo's in Haarlem that you see through the archway in the background. But it's this homage that's being paid by somebody who didn't need to honor Dürer, but he wanted to because he thought that he was a follower of Dürer. One of Dürer's most famous prints, woodcut of the rhinoceros. Dürer never saw the rhinoceros. This is based upon a written text he heard and probably a sketch that is no longer extant. But it came into Lisbon. It was sent from India. And it was a very, very popular print. Well, after Dürer died, his copper plates, his wood blocks sort of scattered to the wind. Some of these things were collected and actually mounted in frames. But others were used over and over and over again. In the case of the rhinoceros, the blocks started, these are pearwood blocks, or we would say a little bit less than an inch thick, with fairly deep cutting. He didn't cut the blocks. He had a Formschneider or a block cutter, professional block cutter, follow what Dürer wanted to do. But it started to break down. But this wood block made its way to Amsterdam, and they thought, we can make money off of it. And they decided to make it into a chiaroscuro, or colored woodcut, to sort of mask over some of the flaws in the original one. They probably did a filling of some of the cracks and things like that. So Dürer never did a colored print, but you find various of his prints, like this one, today. People wanted to buy his art. Now, lots of his prints were available, fewer of his drawings, and even fewer of his paintings. Many of them were in Nuremberg, and the leading princely patrons of the time, Emperor Rudolf II, who was living in Prague, loved Dürer's works. And so he had this one, which is actually in terrible shape nowadays. It was damaged at a later point in time, a bad conservation effort earlier in the 20th century. The Feast of the Rose Garlands was in the church of St. Bartolomeo in Venice, right next to the German merchants, Fondazione de' Tedici, their foundation, their business center and such. But he had it carried in 1606 across the Alps to Prague, not on a cart because he didn't want it to jostle. He had people carrying it literally on their shoulders. I'm not sure that's less jostling, but in any case. But a lot of his collection, not all, but a lot of his collection's at the Kunsthistorische Museum or the Art History Museum in Vienna today. The other great collector, and these two rivaled, they said, I want this picture, I want this picture. So they were sometimes bidding at each other or doing some underhanded political things to the city of Nuremberg. Dürer gave this painting in 1526 to the city council in Nuremberg. This is when iconoclasm was happening, the Protestant Reformation's happening. He wanted this image in the city hall rather than in a church, so it would be preserved. But Maximilian, Duke of Bavaria, later elected Bavaria, wanted this, and so he was able to get it from the city, and it's in Munich. The other great collections at the Alte Pinakothek, or the Old Painting Museum in Munich. But Maximilian didn't want these little Lutheran texts down at the bottom, so he had them cut off, and they were only reattached in the early 20th century. But the idea, you're going out, you're sending agents all over trying to get paintings by Albrecht Dürer. That's why Vienna, Munich have some of the greatest collections today. But you find his prints circulating widely. Again, you make an object, you sell it, it's out of your hands. So what happens to it afterwards, it's whatever fate will do. But you find his pictures, usually it's his prints, popping up in unusual contexts. Besides being models for all sorts of things in all different media, you'll find things like, this is a wonderful picture by the Flemish artist Frans Franken the Younger, the collector's cabinet with all sorts of marvelous things. It's a little bit bright, but maybe you can see some of the details of it. But right smack in the very center of this is his portrait, Dürer's print that he made in about 1525 or so of Frederick the Wise, Elector of Saxony, whose first great patron, somebody who was a patron throughout Dürer's career, but it's been put into a collector's cabinet on the door in the most secure place within, once this cabinet folds up, the most secure place in it. Well, you also find it in Italian, and you find it in Spanish art during this period where, in this case, Pietro Paolini did this image of a young man. We don't know who the individual is, but he's looking out at us, but he's been contemplating one of Dürer's prints from the small woodcut series, a Man of Sorrow's image he's been contemplating. So you see Dürer's images popping up, and it's part of how his repertory, his works were circulating so widely during this period. And you get, as you start to approach 1628, the 100th anniversary of Dürer's death, you begin to get medals being made, you get other sort of homages being made. But this is a print by Lucas Killian of Augsburg, where we see two Dürers. So if one isn't enough, you have two of them. They're both based upon his actual self-portraits, and it tells you on either side in the tablets where these things were. But he's being honored in this temple of honor. He's being honored for his many, many gifts. On the left-hand side over here, we have sort of tools that you have for drafting, tools that an architect and such will use. You have some over here on the right side. He's being honored for his theory. He's being honored for his skill as a painter and a printmaker in this as well. They thought he might even have been an architect. He wasn't. His coat of arms is up at the very top of all this. But on the table right here, between the two Dürers, it says, labor and consistency. Down below, in Latin, it says, virtue lives even after death. But they are celebrating not only Dürer as a printmaker, not only Dürer as an artist, but Dürer as a theoretician. He was the first German theoretician of art. He had to invent a lot of the language. One of my favorite is, what's the German word for spiral? Well, it didn't exist at his point in time, so he called it a Schneckenlinie, a snail line. So you get the idea of the curve. So he had to try to find the right words, just like Martin Luther had to invent a lot of new words for the German language for his writings. But Dürer did 3 texts: The Instruction in Measurement, Treatise on Fortification, 4 books on human proportions. These are pretty dry, but they still were sort of a foundation set of texts that artists throughout the 16th, 17th century looked at, sometimes used, sometimes commented, sometimes said, well, we don't think that they're quite as useful as some other newer texts. But he was valued for his intellect, not just what he was producing with his hand, but for his intellect. You were so astute earlier when you said Dürer looked like Christ. A Munich court artist, Georg Fischer, spent some time in Nuremberg, and this picture was created probably in 1637. And so what do we have here? Christ as Dürer. Sort of a nice turning around. And you can find sort of Dürer-esque images of Christ in German Bibles, 18th, 19th century as well, because sort of the long-haired type is really something that appealed. It sort of embodies what some people thought Christ should look like. Napoleon. What does Napoleon have to do? We'll get to Napoleon shortly. 1728, the 200th anniversary of Dürer's death, Konrad Arendt wrote the first monograph, the sort of biography of Dürer. He'd seen a lot of the prints that were in Wolfenbüttel at the Ducal Library there. So the first monograph, it's not necessarily the first monograph of an artist, because some earlier ones had come, and there have been some shorter lives of Dürer before that. But again, the fame of the artist is still there. What does Napoleon have to do with this? Napoleon and his troops overran parts of Germany, overran most of Europe. In 1795, there was a Treaty of Basel, and this meant that Prussia, the Holy Roman Empire, had to give up a lot of land and a lot of control. In fact, the Holy Roman Empire would cease to exist. It had been created in the year 800 by Charlemagne, but it ceased to exist in 1806. But all the land on the Rhine River west of the river was now French. This meant Cologne, Strasbourg, Colmar, and various other towns. This area has gone back and forth between Germany and France in subsequent centuries. And so this meant, along with the suppression of churches, particularly monasteries, but churches, a lot of their art was just destroyed. Some of it was sold off. Some of it ended up in museums. But it meant that if you're a German, whether northern Germany, southern Germany, wherever, what did it mean to be German? Because there was no German nation. It didn't happen until 1871. But they said, is it simply linguistic? Well, you have different types of German spoken in different parts of the country. Even today, Bavarian German is not the same as what you find in Hanover to the north. But what does it mean? So language was one thing they held on to. But they started thinking, when was Germany really honored? When was it at its creative cultural peak? It's the time of Albrecht Dürer, Martin Luther, around 1500 and thereabouts, when it was famed throughout Europe for its art, its religion, and all of that. So you get this nostalgia coming in, and you have writers who are trying to look back to the time of Dürer and think, this was a golden age. How can we recapture that? It seems like every society tries to recapture some fictive golden age that they have in the past. And this still happens today. On the screen right now is a print that was not produced until 1832, but it was after a drawing from about 1809, 1810 by the Romantic artist Franz Fuller, who died very, very young. What do we see here? What's sort of the message of this? Because you, as friends of this museum, maybe sometimes you get a nice little Christmas card or something like that. This was actually sent to friends of the museum, the Städel Art Institute in Frankfurt, out to their members in 1832. But what does it convey? What does it tell us? They're worshiping art. We see two figures, Albrecht Dürer on the left-hand side and Raphael on the right-hand side, at the throne of art. They were sort of celebrated in literature, in plays, exhibitions sometimes, as the two greatest artists of the Renaissance. Raphael for Italy, and Dürer for Northern Europe. Dürer has the skyline of Nuremberg, sort of similar to what you saw in the Nuremberg Chronicle at the beginning of this lecture. Raphael has St. Peter's, the Vatican, immediately behind him as well. Now, there's all sorts of rather, not, I think, high-quality literature, but all sorts of interesting literature nonetheless that was produced during this period by Friedrich Schlegel, Goethe, Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, among others. But one of the intriguing things was a book by Wilhelm Heinrich Wackenroder called A Memorial to Our Venerable Ancestor Albrecht Dürer by the Art-Loving Friar, that was published in 1796. A nice long title. But in this, again, it's this evocation. Can we go back to this golden age? I yearn for the time when Hans Sachs is producing plays in Nuremberg and Albrecht Dürer is walking its cobblestone streets and such. But in this, there's this wonderful sequence where he falls asleep and he has this dream that he's going through the Dresden Portrait Gallery. Now, the Dresden Museum, the princely collection, at that point in time, the royal collection. And he suddenly hears voices in the dark in the galleries as he's going through. And artists who created the paintings are standing by their pictures, but he goes around to another gallery, and there are two figures holding hands, talking to each other. Anybody want to guess who they are? Okay, Raphael and Dürer. So they're there, and he says, oh, it was so wonderful. And I listened to him for a while, and then I went to ask him a question. And what happens in a dream when you go to ask somebody a question? Okay, you wake up, And so he couldn't ask his question. But again, this notion that these two artists knew each other. In fact, they did know each other. They exchanged presents at one point in time in 1521. Raphael sent Dürer some drawings of, nude male bodies, figure studies. Dürer sent him a self-portrait, which we know existed still and later in the 16th century, but has since been lost. So they were aware of each other, and they obviously thought highly enough of each other to send each other presents. 1828. Let's go back a couple years. 1826, and even a little bit before that. The citizens in Nuremberg thought, okay, Dürer's 300th anniversary of his death is coming, and we want to have a big jubilee. Nothing like this had really ever been done before. You have artists, there was a big celebration for Raphael in Rome at one point in time, but nothing quite like this, where they planned exhibitions, they had plays all about the theme of Dürer. You could go get schnitzel with little Dürer kitsch stuff around it, or you can get a nice little cream torte with AD monogram pressed into that as well. But thousands of people came. And at this point in time, there was two major sites they could go to. The Albrecht Dürer house, which you have here, which was bought by the city in 1826. It was given after some renovations 2 years later on to an artist society, which soon was called the Albrecht Dürer Verein, or Society, or Association. And in 1871, this was actually 1871, it's actually turned into the Albrecht Dürer Museum, which it is today. Don't go there hoping for a whole lot of original Dürers. They're elsewhere. But it was the second oldest museum of an artist's house. The first one is the Casa Buonarroti in Florence of Michelangelo, which he never lived in. It was a relative's house, and that was established about 13 or 14 years earlier. So a place that you could, as a pilgrim, an art pilgrim, could come, or you could go to his tomb, or you could buy a print like this one, where Dürer is looming up over all of this. His tomb is there, his house is there, and some other nice things. You could buy lots of different Dürer sort of kitsch if you want to. Whoops, back. Now, a fortunate coincidence was that his death date, his death date fell on Easter Sunday. So the coincidence of this was not lost on the organizers. And they had church celebrations, they had festival celebrations in the city hall, but elsewhere in the city, in the castle, they had a couple of different art exhibitions. But on Sunday morning, before dawn, a group of them, including the artist who did this one, Ludwig Emil Grimm, left the city at 6 a.m., and they processed out of the city. Dignitaries, art lovers, various others processed westward out of the city to the St. Johannes or St. John's Cemetery, which is about 0.8 of a mile outside of the Tiergartentor, or gate. Grimm described the service as follows, quote, "A solemn silence had fallen. Suddenly it was broken by the mighty sounds of tubas reverberating around us. Sublime," I don't think of tubas as sublime, sorry if you're a tuba, sublime and deeply moving as they announced the high solemnity of the hour and the day. The wind abated, the clouds parted, and the sun in all of its glory rose over the old castle, illuminating the lovely churchyard and our large solemn gathering. How we wish all of our absent friends could have been here to experience this great moment with us, unquote. And you can see the castle, on the hillside way off in the distance here. And there are other descriptions of this, and apparently it was quite a moving thing. And they then went on and had church services afterwards. But this is Easter Sunday. We've already talked about Dürer as Jesus, or as Christ earlier. They decided we need to have a tangible monument to Dürer. Already in 1826, 27, they started discussing this, trying to figure out who the sculptor should be, where it should be situated, and importantly, who's going to pay for it. They eventually picked the Berlin sculptor Christian Daniel Rauch, who was probably the best German sculptor at this point in time. And they decided, let's put it in the Milk Market, which they soon afterwards renamed the Albrecht Dürer Platz, or the Albrecht Dürer Square Marketplace. And this is what you see today. Dürer's house is actually just up the street a couple blocks to the northwest part of the city. But this is a large public space. And so in 1828, during the celebration, they didn't have the statue, they only had sort of a model of it, because the statue, for funding reasons and other things, wasn't placed until 1840, but when it was placed in 1840, it was the oldest statue, public statue of an artist anywhere in Europe. A few years later on, you get Rembrandt, you get Rubens, you get Velázquez, but this was the very first of those. And during the celebration, imagine this square filled with at least 700 people, torches, flags, banners all around, lined with soldiers, endless speeches by politicians. That doesn't happen nowadays. Endless speeches of politicians and such. But they finally unveiled it in 1828. But this is only after many people had actually gone through a procession, starting at the city hall, winding through some of the streets to different places that Dürer had stopped at or had friends at, or St. Sabala's Church, which was his parish church, up to his house, then back down. So you imagine, this is like a religious procession. And I should add that Rauch's statue, at least the head portion of it, you can find in lots of places, including Valhalla, the great shrine to German magnificence that's on the slopes of the Danube River, not too far from Regensburg. Now, there was exhibitions in Nuremberg. Artists like these two, Hartmann is shown in a self-portrait with his two sons, talking about the greatness of Albrecht Dürer. And Dürer's house is in the background, just behind where Hartmann's hand is situated. Others said, okay, I'm going to do an image. This is Wintergerst, an image of St. John's Cemetery, where Dürer is being welcomed into heaven by God the Father, Christ. Christ is over here, the Virgin Mary is on the side, the figure of faith, his guardian angel. We have St. Peter over there. We actually have his father and his teacher over on this side, and various other people, King David back there as well. Moses is there. And one unhappy person, who's that? A little hard to see, it's the devil. The devil's really sad, really mad. He's getting all this adulation. But this is how he was treated. This sort of celebration isn't happening for any of the other German Renaissance artists, or really any of the other artists at this point in time. In Berlin, they also had a very elaborate festival. Subsequently, famous architect Carl Friedrich Schinkel created this monument, which is life-size. It was in the Sing Academy in Berlin, where they had their procession ended, and they had a feast, where Dürer is here with various personifications of the different arts and things like that, and an image of the Holy Trinity up above. You can see he's being treated differently than most other artists. The Scottish painter, William Bell Scott, who would write the first major English monograph on the life and art of Albrecht Dürer, spent some time in the city. And I like this one, which is in the National Gallery of Scotland, where we see our protagonist in his house, peering over into the square to the Tiergarten gate right there, which winds through the fortifications, the castles up above. If you go to the square today, there's lots of cafes. There's the Dürer Hotel, the Dürer Cafe, the Dürer Restaurant, the Dürer bookstore, the Dürer, you name it. Dürer sells. And Dürer does sell. That's one of the things that's sort of interesting about his afterlife. The 19th century is the great century of museums in Europe. And many of these museums wanted to educate you by having images of famous artists on the outside or the inside. They could be in sculpture. They could be, if you go to the Rijksmuseum, outside and inside, you have dozens of artists, including Albrecht Dürer. And Dürer appears in about 36 of these museums during the 19th century. Because they want you to know this is what we have in our collection, and even if you don't, these are the famous artists that you should know. And it's sort of the standard greatest hits of the Renaissance and the Baroque period. The Alta Pinakothek was badly bombed in World War II. The south facade, which you see here, once had sculptures, 24 sculptures of famous artists, including Albrecht Dürer right there. And then when you went inside, today you have these staircases that go like this up to the second floor, or the first upper floor. That didn't exist. Rather, on that south side, just on the inside, there you had this loggia, and each bay had one or two different artists, plus various allegories. And Dürer was given his own bay with different stories about his life. Again, all we have are some drawings, and this is a pre-war photograph going into Wolgemuth's workshop, there with his best friend Willibald Pirkheimer and the unhappy wife Agnes over on the side there. And there were paintings on the walls as well. But not just there, but elsewhere in the museum as well. But you find this over and over again. You go to the Kunsthistorisches Museum, or the Art History Museum in Vienna, one of the great museums of the world. And in the Golden Hall, you'll look up in the ceiling and you see this huge painting. It's the patronage of the House of Habsburg. Because much of the collection there originally was part of the Habsburg patrimony. But on the throne right there is Maximilian I and his favorite artist, Albrecht Dürer. Maximilian is looking at one of Dürer's drawings or prints. But you have Charles V, you have Rudolph II, you have various other famous Habsburg patrons being shown in this as well. But he has the most prominent place. He appears like 6 different places at the museum, including the grand staircase. If we're in another one, in Karlsruhe, the Kunsthalle, you go into the museum and you're walking upstairs. Originally, the upstairs was mostly art studios, but then became the gallery space. And as you turn on the landing, you suddenly encounter Loach's statues of Raphael on this side and Dürer on this side. And here's the Dürer representation. And there's some interesting distinctions between the two of them. But I can't help, every time I go to this museum, sort of patting Dürer on the head as I go by. I know I shouldn't touch the statue, it's bad for it. But I'm sure I'm not the first nor the last to do that. But every time you, the art student, or you, the museum, go up the staircase, you're supposed to see, here are the two luminaries that really defined, in the eyes of the 19th century, defined great art, and hopefully you'd find some great art in their museum. How many of you have been to the Metropolitan Museum before? How many of you looked at anything outside besides the hot dog vendor? Okay. You go into the museum and you don't really notice it. Right over the doorway here is Albrecht Dürer. There's Rembrandt. There's 6 little roundels that were carved. were carved by Karl Bitter, and Dürer is based upon the painting we saw, the 1500 self-portrait. So even here, but other museums like the Art Institute in Chicago, if you look on the facade of that, they don't have statues, but they have the names of famous artists, and Dürer, you'll find Dürer there. Let's make things a little bit more serious. During the end of the 19th century, as Germany was coming together as a country, you had lots of very popular magazines and things like that, often with illustrations. And Dürer's prints were very, very popular in many of these things. It was the idea of Bildung, or the sort of education, moral education of the German citizenry. And so Dürer was very well known, lots of books, although some people thought maybe he wasn't true German because his father was Hungarian. Never mind. But on the left-hand side is Dürer's Night, Death, and the Devil, one of his most famous prints. A copy of this print, including from the Germanisches Nationalmuseum in German National Museum in Nuremberg, was given to Hitler. Eventually, it was given back after the war. He had it in his bunker in Berlin, along with a whole bunch of other Dürer drawings and watercolors and prints, because he liked to look at Dürer's work. And the painting on the right-hand side is quoting the Dürer, but putting Adolf Hitler in it. You know, the armor and such, the way he holds onto the reins right there, the sort of steadfast look that he's not being deterred by anything. He's a man of destiny. What do you notice has happened to the painting? If you look at the area around the eyes right there, an American soldier saw this and bayoneted it. This is actually owned by the American government. It's in some warehouse in the Washington, D.C. area as well. But Hitler loved Nuremberg. He held his rallies there. This is why the Nuremberg trials afterwards were held in Nuremberg, because it was such a symbolic city for the National Socialists. On the left-hand side is a picture that I sort of stumbled over, I admit, by a war correspondent, David Friedenthal. He was there in 1947, reporting probably on the trials and such, but giving you a picture of the Albrecht Dürer Platz and some of the buildings right around. Everything's destroyed. But what had been preserved? Miraculously. They had put concrete and other things around it, but the statue of Albrecht Dürer is the only thing that stood. He thought that this is sort of a symbolic image. And so you see the Rauch statue over on the right-hand side. Bring us a little bit closer to date, 1971. In this case, it was the 500th anniversary of his birth, born in 1471. And the city of Nuremberg decided, we need to do something big. We need to do a large exhibition. We need to really reclaim the artist Albrecht Dürer. One of the Hermann Glaser, who is the cultural advisor in the city of Nuremberg, remarked in one of his speeches there, it will be the task of a Dürer year, that is 1971, to free him from the ideological rubble that has settled over him. The Germanisches Nationalmuseum did a huge exhibition. 360,000 people attended it. And here's the exhibition catalog, which I like because it has a lot of his sort of geometric and proportional drawings on it. But you're a visitor to the town, you want to go to the exhibition, you come into the Hauptbahnhof, or the main train station, and you would have been greeted by Albrecht Dürer, this large figure there. But there was lots of other exhibitions, both formal and informal. Faber, which is an art supply company, and I was just given some Faber things before our talk tonight by Dr. Klein, they sent artists, they gave grants to several artists, go to where Dürer went. Dürer went to the Low Countries. He went to Italy. He went to Venice as well. And give us sort of your image of his experiences. Dürer left us letters from his time in Venice. He left us a very detailed journal from his time in the Netherlands in 1521. So one of the artists who has a little bit of a humor is Prechtel, and he shows Dürer learning how to draw the nude, but in a gondola with all these beautiful women on all sides. Not always quite as respectful as I think some of Dürer's fans might have thought. But there were some informal pop-ups, we might call them nowadays. Klaus Steck was a lawyer, but also an artist, but a social critic. And there was a very heated debate in Germany about housing, about subsidized housing and such at this point in time. And so he borrowed Dürer's drawing. Dürer did this marvelous image of his mother at age 63. And she was probably suffering from cancer at that point in time. She had given birth to 18 children. How many men just said, oh, no. But only 3 lived to adulthood, Dürer and 2 younger brothers. Mortality rates were very, very high, but exceptionally high in his family. And so he did this, and she would die not too long after that. But Steck took this image, put it on a poster, and said, would you rent a room to this woman? And, we're looking at it, you think she might be some sort of crazy lady. I wouldn't rent a room to her. No, but she's the mother of one of the greatest artists. He's making a social criticism, but using Dürer's work here and a few other cases to make his point. I should add that there was an exhibition in Berlin maybe 15 years ago, which had a picture of Dürer's mother next to a 63-year-old Sophia Loren. She didn't give birth to 18 kids, so... And some of his works have sparked lots and lots, we're getting close to the end, lots and lots of replicas. Dürer did this beautiful watercolor of a large hare in 1502. Hans Hofmann, a Nuremberg artist who ended up working for Rudolf II as his Dürer specialist, made numerous direct copies, but also this one, which the Getty Museum has spent a lot of money for a few years back. And these things were famous, both in the original and in copies. And I really like Ottmar Horrels. He works at the art school, one of the art schools in Nuremberg. He likes to replicate things, whether it's little Martin Luther's or in this case, Dürer's rabbit. So we have 7,000 of them filling the main square in Nuremberg. But again, it's sort of, how does Dürer inspire your art? How does Dürer inspire your creativity? His hands, his praying hands, this is a watercolor that he made as a study for one of the altarpieces he was doing. And it's noted for the hands, the veining and such on it, the wrinkling or the turning over of the sleeve in this case. You find it lots and lots of places. Andy Warhol has it on his tomb outside of Pittsburgh. I was driving in Austin one time going to get a taco, and I discovered El Federico's version of this, which is Dürer's hand, and he's washing it because this was in the middle of COVID. This is in 2020. In 2009, 2010, Greece was a mess. Financially, politically, it was in very bad shape. It had to be rescued by the common market. And so a group of artists decided, we need help. We need divine help. So on this hotel side, it's called the Vienna Hotel, they created this praying hands, but facing down, coming from God down towards the streets of Athens in this instance. I think a very powerful one. One of my colleagues in my department is from Athens, and his father used to work just down the street from this, and so he thought this was great. Dürer tattoos. When I drove up here, or walked up here this morning, and I saw you had a tattoo exhibition, I thought, oh, this works. Because it's really quite a marvelous exhibition. But Dürer has been a very popular subject. I didn't see any in the show, but a very popular subject. And I had to track down this tattoo artist who works in Cleveland, because I thought, this is a spectacular copy of Night, Death, and the Devil. on some individual's back. He couldn't tell me the name of the person, but I thought, there's a lot of Dürer tattoos out there. In fact, you don't want to start doing a Google search for Dürer tattoos because you're going to find some in places you don't want to see. But here we have the rhinoceros. Here we have another image from his Apocalypse. So these things resonate. Justin Bieber apparently has a Dürer praying hand somewhere on his body. I don't want to know where. In 2010, I had the privilege of being a visiting fellow at the American Academy in Berlin, in Wannsee, sort of southwestern Berlin. And I was wandering through the garden there one day, and I came across this little statue about this high. I thought, I know who that is. A historian, a friend of mine who teaches at Vanderbilt. Yeah, my kids used to put, grasses on this statue and such. I said, you were desecrating Albrecht Dürer. Well, it turns out a colleague of mine in Berlin, two colleagues in Berlin, one who's now the director of the Gemeinsame National Museum, they came up because I invited them to dinner at the Academy because we had really good food, and they're going to be in Berlin. And so they looked at this thing and they go, we need it for our exhibition. They were planning a major exhibition in 2012 in Nuremberg of the early Dürer. And so this is based upon his 1483 drawing that you see over on the left-hand side. They had it renovated. It looks much better there than it did when I found it in the garden. And this is the entrance to the exhibition. Because I thought, again, this is the afterlife of Dürer. Dürer's image is living on and inspiring artists, in this case, probably around 1880 or thereabouts. 1989, the Berlin Wall falls. It's a very, very lively time in Germany there and a few years after. Lots of problems also happened, but in any case. And I was going through a whole bunch of prints and things in the City Museum in Nuremberg, and I came across this, sex and drugs and rock and roll with Albrecht Dürer with a joint in his hand and putting his arms around Marilyn Monroe. What they're expecting, I don't know, probably joints in Marilyn Monroe. They're expecting a lively night, but it's eye-catching. Bringing your local hero and Marilyn Monroe, bringing them together to make lively times in the city. There's lots of advertisements and things. I just have about 3 more images. Advertisements, but this is one that really appealed to me. On the left is a self-portrait in the Prado today. Dürer did in 1498, where he's there with a view probably of the Alpine forehills in the background and such. And an advertising agency based in Switzerland made a series of prints. They did one for Frida Kahlo, one for Van Gogh, and one for Dürer. This is the Dürer one, where they're hawking their Samsung NX Mini camera. But this one is really clever. Dürer's in the space. He's got cobwebs or spider webs up at the top there. Before he does it, he's brushed his hair. Remember that hair relic I showed you earlier? Brushed his hair, and there's some hair sort of sticking out of it. There's a fly on the table, because one of the paintings that's now in Prague once had a fly on the Virgin's robe, sort of an illusionistic image, and there's lots of tradition of doing things like that. So there's several different references they made, and so here we have him staring into the viewer of this, about to take his, not a selfie, but a self-portrait, as it says. You fly into Nuremberg today, and you fly into the Albrecht Dürer Airport. Remember I showed you the train station earlier. That's still the Hauptbahnhof. They haven't named it after Dürer, but they named the airport after Dürer. It's a fairly small one. And the advertising information they give is, he was a commuter between his hometown of Nuremberg and destinations in Italy and the Netherlands. He was a visionary, pioneer, and trendsetter at the same time. Dürer broke new ground and crossed borders. If Albrecht Dürer was alive today, he would be a frequent traveler. I remember going into this airport one time and going, really? Okay, good. So what does he have in his hand? He has a paper airplane. There's a certain sense of humor in all of this, which I find quite refreshing. One of my grad students, I took a seminar to Nuremberg one time, and also to Vienna, to look at works by Dürer and other contemporary artists from his period. And so one of the grad students gave me the little Playmobil figure. You can also buy Martin Luther. There's several other ones you could buy as well. I want to end with one last one. In 2028, there will be, presumably, to celebrate the 500th anniversary of his death, presumably lots of exhibitions in different countries. In 1971, we also had exhibitions in Boston, Philadelphia, and National Gallery, and various other places. In 2012, when I was in Nuremberg, I came across, this is just part of a banner for a little exhibition that was going to be in the city hall. But what has Dürer been reduced to? The hair stands in for the man in this instance. You can deconstruct the figure down to this, but you still know who it is. Yes, it says Dürer, but still you know who the figure is. So hopefully this is just a little bit of the afterlife that I wanted to present to you tonight. These stories, the use of his art, taking his life story, using it and often abusing it, twisting it around to serve some political purpose. It's part of the history of Albrecht Dürer. So thank you very much for coming tonight. I appreciate it. I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have. Yes?
Yeah, is there any place where they still use his woodblock?
Okay, the question is there any place they still use his woodblocks? A large collection of his woodblocks exist in Berlin, but you're not going to really use those much. You might make replicas of these things and then use those, pulling sort of modern impressions from them. But I think the last time I know of his woodblocks being actually used is probably earlier in the 20th centuries. I was taking my students to the Albertina in Vienna one time, and a friend of mine who's the chief curator there said, let's go down into this most secure place in the museum, where if anything happens, there's sort of a UNESCO agreement that they have to subscribe to. You have to pull these things off the shelves first and scoot them out of the museum. And down there, besides Dürer's watercolors like the large hair and such, you also found some of his woodblocks. And it's interesting trying to track his woodblocks over the centuries because, it's just wood. Worms, will eat into it, other insects and things like that. But a moderate number survive, whereas only one of his copper plates, that of the portrait of Philip Melanchthon, has survived. Because these things often got used, or sometimes they were melted, well, not so much melted, but in a fire, which is sort of melting. Other questions? The question is the hair the greatest painting he ever did? I'm assuming you're not talking about this hair, but the rabbit, okay. The rabbit is stunning. Again, we were down in the vaults at the Albertina with magnifying glasses looking at it like this close, and the students were just agog. It is a spectacular work. But also, it tells you a lot about the development of science based upon observation that's starting to happen in the 16th century. Dürer is sometimes cited as really one of the first great lookers who's able to record what he sees in such a precise fashion. And Hans Hofmann, who I showed you, he did lots of copies, but you put those next to his, and the animal isn't alive. Dürer's animal is alive, although I keep thinking, how did he get it to hold still? It was probably a stuffed animal. We don't know, either that or it kept hopping up and he kept pulling it back, or having somebody else pull it back. Other questions? Yes, sir.
What year did Dürer become a Protestant?
Excuse me?
What year
did Dürer become Protestant? The city of Nuremberg, after a great deal of local debate, voted in the city council, and Dürer was a member of the city council, to become Lutheran in 1525. Dürer was already part of a group of sort of wealthy patricians, scholars and such in Nuremberg that was part of a group called the Sodality Staupitziana, or the Staupitz. Johann Staupitz was Martin Luther's, when he was still a monk, it was the head of his order, the Augustinian order. So probably around 1520 or so, when he's in Antwerp in 1521, he lists buying certain Lutheran texts there. So he's interested, but it may be another few years. But his best friend, Willibald Pirkheimer, the great humanist, was Lutheran for a little while, but then he went back to Catholic. You just simply didn't know. In families, the issue sort of divided people. But in Nuremberg, it was a huge political deal because they redid the educational system. They brought in Melanchthon to have a different type of education, but also meant the Holy Roman Emperor, in that case with Charles V, was really mad at you. We don't want a powerful person in office being mad at you. But, so that did cause them some political and economic problems. But he remained a Lutheran the last few years of his life. Other questions? Well, then, thank you very much for coming this evening. I appreciate it.